Kenneth McDuff was back on the streets, cocky and vicious and deadly as ever, 21 years after he should have died in the electric chair for the horrific murder of 3 youngsters. McDuff is from the little town of Rosebud in central Texas, where they load firearms to the brim and padlock their homes with large pieces of furniture. According to John Kilgore, editor of the Rosebud News, this is a walking town, but in recent years, you see very few people on the streets. When McDuff was released from jail, rumors spread like wildfire that he would show up at festival days in Marlin, the county seat of Falls County, and kill 1 person for every day he was incarcerated. Tommy Salmon, the 8th grader who was humiliated by McDuff in a playground brawl, was concerned about his children's safety now that they were teenagers. When the man who stopped McDuff from killing a young woman with a broomstick pressed the button on his phone's answering machine, he heard the sound of 3 gunshots, a dress rehearsal for what McDuff would do to a teenage girl in southern Tarrant County a few months later. Certainly, Kenneth McDuff had returned to town. In 1989, on October 11th, longtime friend and Deputy U.S. Marshal in Waco, Larry Pamplin, called his counterpart in Falls County, Parnell McNamara, and said, "You're not going to believe what happened, Parnell." McNamara was stunned into silence as he tried to make sense of this seemingly irrational news. "They've paroled Kenneth McDuff. Have they gone crazy?" It seemed like there was no way around it. McDuff was the most brutal, sadistic, and remorseless criminal that either of these seasoned lawmen had ever encountered. He was not just another killer who had slipped through the cracks. Their father, the late Deputy U.S. Marshal T. McDuff, was close with McDuff, therefore their family has known him for over 25 years. P. McNamara and the late Sheriff of Falls County, Brady Pamplin, were among those who had witnessed McDuff's brutality firsthand. In 1966, Brady Pamplin shot McDuff's automobile to bits as he sought to escape capture for the 3 murders for which McDuff was wanted. Brady Pamplin's failure to eliminate McDuff at the time when he could have done so raised many eyebrows. As teenagers around the same age as McDuff, the experience left an indelible mark on Larry Pamplin, Parnell McNamara, and Parnell's brother, Mike, who is also a deputy marshal in Waco. Brady Pamplin was a legendary figure who had been a Texas Ranger before World War II and served as sheriff of Falls County for nearly 30 years. Parnell McNamara remembered how Brady Pamplin's voice broke as he described the killings to Parnell's father, TP. "He put a broomstick across the throat of that poor little girl up in Tarrant County and broke her neck just like you'd kill a possum." The lawman's anger sprang from the system's complete failure, from the many times McDuff had defied authority and sent it reeling. Law enforcement in Central Texas, including Brady Pamplin, had been dealing with McDuff since he was a youngster, during which time they had witnessed glimpses of his cruel nature and his complete disregard for the standards of civilization. In 1965, they believed they had him locked up for good on multiple counts of burglary. McDuff received a total of 52 years in prison time, but because he was only 18, his sentences will run concurrently rather than consecutively. McDuff became trustworthy in 3 months and was out on the streets again in under 10, a satisfied grin spreading over his face the entire time. McDuff embarked on one of his periodic killing sprees 8 months after he was paroled, taking the lives of 3 teens. As a result of the Supreme Court's judgment in McDuff's case in 1972, which virtually overturned all death sentences in the United States, his sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 10 years after the killings, in 1976, McDuff was parole eligible. However, the parole board was under no obligation to release him, and few people expected that they would. The clock was on McDuff's side, though. After being denied parole several times, he finally was granted parole, and now police are saying that 9 women may have been killed as a direct result of his release. What the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles couldn't see, the rest of the country learned this spring: Kenneth McDuff is a cold-blooded killer with no remorse. A nationwide manhunt ensued after he was featured on America's Most Wanted. His bizarre career path made national headlines in Texas, particularly in the I-35 corridor where he tracked his victims. Kenneth McDuff, by the time he was apprehended, had become a symbol for the flood of violent crime that had swept Texas during the previous year, a crime wave aided by a cynical parole regime whose objective has been to empty the jails rather than defend the streets. An convict needs 2 votes from a 3-person parole board team to be granted parole by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the new name for the super board that governs paroles, pardons, and the prison system in Texas. McDuff only received one of the 2 votes he required in 1979 and again in 1980, losing by what must have appeared to him a simple matter of bad luck. McDuff attempted to sway the parole board's decision the next year by giving $10,000 to one of its members. He was put on trial for his bribery attempt and found guilty. Even though he had been convicted of bribery and had 3 prior convictions for murder, the parole board still considered him a good risk for release. McDuff again came within 1 vote of freedom in 1984 and 1985. The parole board has refused to say what the new evidence was, although typically it would be letters of protest from the court and the prosecutor at his trial. He was finally granted a second vote in 1988 and approved for parole, but the approval was revoked when new material was obtained. After a year, the parole board decided to let McDuff back into society, shocking not only the trial officials but even the police. McDuff had not just slipped through the cracks in the system, rather, he had done so with the cunning and stealth of a scurrying rodent. Upon McDuff's release from jail and subsequent instructions to report to a parole officer in Temple, where his parents now resided, Sheriff Larry Pamplin made a bold proclamation. 3 days later, the naked body of 29-year-old Seraphia Parker was discovered in a field of weeds in southeast Temple, beaten and strangled. He told Parnell and Mike McNamara, "I don't know if it'll be next week or next month or next year, but one of these days, dead girl's gonna start turning up, and when that happens, the man you need to look for is Kenneth McDuff." Urged to roam when Kenneth was a kid, the McDuffs weren't the nicest people in town by any stretch of the imagination, but neither were they low-class slum dwellers. They toiled diligently, put aside a tidy sum, and were dedicated members of the Assembly of God. The elder Kenneth has a dad named J. McDuff, a cement finisher, raked in the dough during the 70s and 80s thanks to Temple's construction boom. Addie McDuff governed her 4 daughters and 2 boys with an iron fist, kept the family's finances in order, and ran a washateria directly across the street from their home on Main Street. John Kilgore, the editor of the local newspaper, reflected on the McDuffs' parenting style, writing, "The McDuffs were very dedicated to their children, attentive, protective, making sure they grew up knowing how to work and work hard. There were those who felt they were too cautious." To Addie McDuff and her 3 older daughters, Kenneth was like a youthful deity, exempt from the norms that governed their behavior. Kenneth was the youngest child in the family, despite having a younger sister. Kenneth was known by his classmates to always be well-dressed and financially secure. Later in life, his mother gifted him the noisiest motorcycle in all of Rosebud. When Kenneth was charged with the 3 murders in Tarrant County, his father, J. McDuff, said to a lawman, "If I believed he did what you say, the state wouldn't have to kill him." Clearly, J. McDuff did not share his wife's unwavering devotion to Kenneth. "Obviously, I'd do it myself." In the late 1950s, Kenneth's older brother Lonnie was the family's genuine troublemaker. He once threatened the well-liked but stern administrator of Rosebud High School, D.L. Mayo, and was then ejected down the stairs for being so rude. Rough Tough Lonnie McDuff, or Wuff Tough Lonnie McDuff, as Lonnie, who often found it difficult to express himself, loved to call himself. Lonnie was murdered by the ex-husband of the lady he was seeing while Kenneth was serving time for murder. In Kenneth McDuff's jail file, it is written that he was never taught responsibility or expected to follow rules as a child, and that if any trouble happened. As soon as the school tried to discipline Kenneth, Addie McDuff would storm in, screaming that the school was at fault and that Kenneth was absolutely innocent. She was known as pistol-packing Mama McDuff by her professors. Special education teacher Ellen Roberts says, "Every teacher in school was afraid of her. The story of Addie McDuff brandishing a weapon and confronting a school bus driver who had expelled her son the day before for fighting was widely circulated in Rosebud. Whether or not the story is accurate, it shows how the McDuff family loomed large over the community. Kenneth enjoyed intimidating adults and bullying his peers. Kenneth was known to entice his classmates into a game of quarter flipping so that he could steal their lunch money, as one of his former classmates recalled. Kenneth's sixth-grade teacher apparently had an odd reason for sending him to see Ellen Roberts. There was absolutely no response from him, she alleges. He sat there unmoving and unresponsive, without even meeting her eyes. That's very odd to see in a young lad. Kenneth was not the smartest kid in school, his IQ was only 92. He often made jokes about his bad habits. A former classmate recalls that McDuff's maniacal laughter at things that no one else found funny would dissolve into a glare so hard and cold that it stopped conversation. This was like turning a light on and off, the classmate says, describing how McDuff would make sure everyone in class knew about it when he scored 0 on a test. Those who went to school in Rosebud and knew Kenneth McDuff in 8th grade will never forget the day McDuff dared Tommy Salmon to a fight after school. Tommy was well liked by his peers because he was a talented athlete, a model student, and a man of few words who was difficult to anger. McDuff was baiting him for a fight. One day he was able to successfully embarrass Salmon in front of his peers when he bumped into him in the hallway between classes and called him a chicken shit. Ellen Roberts recalls, Kenneth was so hated that when word got around that he was going to fight Tommy Salmon after school down by the drainage ditch, my whole class talked of nothing else. McDuff was much bigger than Salmon or anyone else at school, but Salmon still managed to beat him effortlessly. McDuff was massive, but weak. In the midst of a headlock from Salmon, McDuff bit Salmon's neck. The day Tommy Salmon freed Rosebud from McDuff's bullying was immortalized in the town's annals. Kenneth stopped being a nuisance to Salmon and the rest of his classmates after that. A short time later, he decided to leave school for good and begin working for his dad. Kenneth's only close friend before or after he dropped out of school was his brother, who listened to his tales of how society had wronged him and gave him advice on how to respond, "Screw 'em," in Lonnie's words. Kenneth told Lonnie that he had raped a lady, cut her throat, and left her for dead in a ditch in the fall of 1964, when he was around 17 and spending his evenings breaking into buildings and prowling for sex. Lonnie encouraged him to forget about it and get some rest. McDuff was arrested for burglary shortly thereafter and subsequently incarcerated. If the parole board had known about the rape and attempted murder, they might not have released McDuff so easily in December 1965. After his initial release on parole, Kenneth McDuff endured a transformation that proved fatal. He was hardened and made to feel invincible by his conviction that he had committed murder and gotten away with it, as well as by the relatively light sentence he received for committing over a dozen burglaries. He was no longer a boy, but a man, standing at 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing in at over 200 pounds, his broad shoulders and huge hands exaggerating his bulk even further. His sinister appearance was accentuated by a crooked smile and a Popeye-like nose. Although McDuff had not learned how to establish friends in prison, he had learned how to recruit smaller, weaker sidekicks who could be controlled by intimidation and counted on to take part in whatever sick plots satisfied McDuff's desires. Kenneth appeared to appreciate having an audience for his hedonism. Roy Dale Green, who worked for Kenneth's father and resided in Marlin with his mother, was one such unhappy acquaintance. Green, who was 2 years younger than Kenneth, was fascinated by McDuff's stories and demonstrations of sadistic sex. For example, McDuff once pinned a girl to the floor and squirted a tube of deep heat into her vagina as a cruel amusement. Kenneth boasted of having raped and strangled multiple women. Telling Green that killing a lady is like to killing a chicken, he said. Before the evening of August 6, 1966, Green wasn't entirely convinced that he believed McDuff when he said, "They both squawk." McDuff couldn't wait until Saturday to go on the hunt. After spending the morning laying concrete at a construction site in Temple, he and Green hit the road for Fort Worth in McDuff's mother's brand new Dodge Charger. Green, then age 18, had never been to Fort Worth before, but McDuff had worked there a few years prior and claimed to know a few gals. Drinking beer and catching up with acquaintances, including a female Kenneth knew from church, they took a night out on the town in the sleepy town of Everman, located south of Fort Worth. Later that night, after the boys had driven the girl home, Kenneth spotted his quarry, a stunning adolescent in a red and white striped blouse and ripped jeans, a complete stranger who had been chatting with the drivers of a 1955 Ford. Edna Sullivan, 16, her lover Robert Brand, 17, and Mark Dunham, 15, Robert's cousin from California, were McDuff's 3 victims. All 3 were picked at random. As McDuff approached the 3 teenagers, Roy Dale Green watched in awe as he retrieved a .38 pistol from behind his car seat. McDuff first ordered the guys to empty their wallets, and then he locked all 3 of them in the trunk of the automobile. "They got a good look at my face," he said to Green. "As in, I'll have to kill them." Green followed in McDuff's Dodge, still not sure that McDuff intended to harm his captives, as McDuff drove the Ford with the teens in the trunk down dark and winding country roads. Suddenly, McDuff veered out into the distance, stopping in a field. After saying, "I want the young lady out," he unlocked the trunk and yanked on her arm. He gave Green the order to put her in the Dodge's trunk, and Green complied. The 2 lads were still in the trunk of the Ford when McDuff raised the gun to chest height and shot them in the face as they begged for their life. He fired 2 shots at Brand, 3 at Dunham, and then lifted Dunham by the hair and fired another shot. After witnessing the gunfire, Green covered his ears and turned away in despair, but not before catching sight of McDuff's expression, which seemed to ask, "How do you like it so far, Roy Dale?" The trunk wouldn't close, so McDuff backed the Ford up against a fence and left Edna Sullivan locked in the trunk of the Dodge as he and Green drove away. After leaving the Ford and the boys' bodies, McDuff and the others drove south, through Johnson County, and stopped along a dirt road about 11 miles away. McDuff forced Edna Sullivan to undress in the trunk, then threw her naked body into the back seat, where he proceeded to rape her. He raped her 3 times, twice himself, once after forcing Green to rape her. Green overheard the girls say only one sentence during this ordeal, "I think you ripped something," as McDuff brutalized her for the 3rd time. For the time being, McDuff was able to control his sexual urges and drive them to a new place down a gravel road. He pulled over and had the girl sit in the front passenger seat. Green was confused as to McDuff's intended meaning. Then he witnessed McDuff slam the girl's head to the floor and start choking her with a broom handle. "He mashed down hard," Green said to the police. Green held Edna Sullivan's legs while Kenneth McDuff crushed her to death. Green said, "She started waving her arms and kicking her legs, and he told me, 'Grab her legs.'" The boys buried their wallets and discarded their bloody underpants before tossing her body over the fence and returning home. Roy Dale Green's life was changed forever by the events of that night. The next day, Green was out on a bike on a Sunday with his pals when the news of the killings arrived on the radio. "Oh my God, I must tell someone," the man sobbed. He testified against Kenneth McDuff as a key prosecution witness, did time for his role in the crimes, and is now back in Marlin. For as long as Sheriff Larry Pamplin can remember, Green has lived in the same house. He stays out at the old family home and spends most of the day in his sister's beer joint, the Town Door, says Pamplin. You may add, to say he's messed up is a real understatement. Addie McDuff, adamant about Kenneth's innocence, retained a Waco attorney and attended the trial with her daughters. McDuff, of course, denied involvement in the murders and testified that he believed Roy Dale Green to be the prime suspect, while also complaining to the jury that Falls County Sheriff Brady Pamplin had a vendetta against him. Mama McDuff informed reporters that her son, Kenneth, was willing to risk death by electric chair to protect the reputation of a girl from his church who had been with him the night the 3 youngsters were killed. "He's too good for his own good," she remarked. McDuff, Inc. needs justice. Kenneth McDuff was granted stays of execution twice in 1969 and once in April 1970, each time within a matter of days before his scheduled death. McDuff was probably not worried at all. While he had been on death row, just a handful of Americans had been put to death in the United States in the 2 years prior to his conviction. The legal process was proceeding with Furman v. Georgia. The Supreme Court issued a seminal decision in 1972, holding that juries should not have absolute discretion in capital trials. This meant that juries could issue death sentences without first considering the specifics of the crime and the accused person's background. It was as if every death sentence in the country had been overturned. All 88 Texans on death row had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment within a matter of months. McDuff was moved to the Ramsey unit and given field work in the prison's agricultural program since he required the highest level of monitoring. "We considered McDuff to be extremely dangerous and a high escape risk," recalls David Christian, who was an assistant warden at the institution in the 1970s. The Kenneth McDuff case took on the hallmarks of a Hollywood melodrama after Addie McDuff retained new legal representation in 1977. A Dallas lawyer called Gary Jackson set in motion a time-consuming and expensive plan to prove that McDuff's malevolent running buddy, Roy Dale Green, was the real killer. Over the course of the next decade, Kenneth McDuff was more than just a client for Gary Jackson. He became an industry, with Justice for McDuff, Inc. being formally established in 1989. Book and film adaptations were discussed up until quite recently. Jackson, who refused to be interviewed for this story and no longer represents McDuff, was an odd choice to spearhead the McDuff campaign, given that both he and his wife were politically active Texans with ties to the Republican Party. His current position in the Army Reserve is that of colonel. As a rule, he avoided cases involving criminal law. Despite this, Gary Jackson became an ardent supporter of the convicted murderer. Jackson reconstructed the events of August 6, 1966 by combing through trial transcripts and newspaper articles and traveling across the country to interview eyewitnesses. In a 1979 letter to the head of the Board of Pardons and Paroles, Jackson provided what he saw as startling new evidence. The letter was 26 pages long and typed in one column. The night of the murders, McDuff gave Green the keys to his brand new Dodge Charger and told him to go out on a date. This testimony was given by McDuff at the trial that took place 13 years ago. Gary Jackson said in the new version that Green required the automobile to pull out a heist, implying that McDuff didn't want anything to do with the robbery but was fine with loaning Green his car. McDuff, in both versions, slept in a burned-out Everman shopping center as Green sated his murderous appetite. How Green could have driven both the Dodge and the Ford was the issue. To get around the seeming impossible, the attorney concocted a narrative in which Green met up with the teens he had met earlier that evening to engage in some underage drinking in the field where the boys' bodies were found. When Green and his new pals finally ran dry of beer, they abandoned the Dodge in the field and drove to the site in Johnson County where Edna Sullivan's body was discovered in order to drink it. That was where Green decided to act. At gunpoint, he made the lads get in the trunk while he raped Edna Sullivan. The boys opened the trunk with force while Green was distracted. Gary Jackson described how Green jumps out of the car and, without thinking, shoots the boys when he realized they were in danger. The 6 shots were a good dramatic touch, they always are in movies, because they showed that Green had run out of guns and was forced to resort to using a broomstick to kill Edna Sullivan. He then leaves her body there and drives back to the original spot, picking up the Dodge and heading to the shopping mall where McDuff is waiting, with the 2 lads still in the trunk. This plan also had the benefit of having all 3 killings occur in Johnson County, which was outside the jurisdiction of the judge and jury who found McDuff guilty. Even though Gary Jackson's letter swayed at least one parole board member to vote in favor of his client, McDuff, the board ultimately decided against granting release. In 1980, the Dallas attorney presented new evidence in the form of a writ of habeas corpus, citing multiple instances of jury misbehavior and tampering. One of the jurors was said to have brought a flask of needful intoxicant into the dorm where the jury was quartered in 1966, and the sheriff of Tarrant County allegedly visited the dorm to inform the jurors of another crime he believed McDuff had committed, according to a story published in the Old Fort Worth Press. In this case, the sheriff allegedly told the jury that they hadn't been allowed to hear about the rape and disfigurement because of stupid legislation. A bailiff called Rose Marie Anderson, who disappeared after the trial, told the media what happened, saying that she had been threatened by the sheriff for speaking out. Gary Jackson found the ex-bailiff in Arizona, and she rehashed her claims in a sworn statement. Jackson was successful in getting McDuff a 1982 Fort Worth evidentiary hearing, but the judge ruled that the claims were not credible. McDuff also wrote other letters during this time, including one to the Court of Criminal Appeals in Austin about an allegation that his trial judge in Fort Worth had stolen $750,000 from the mafia. "We've got the money in the family." Kenneth McDuff wasn't exactly a role model inmate during his 6 years on death row or his 17 years in general population, but he did know how to keep his shirt clean. In extreme circumstances like McDuff's, the authorities often grant their prisoners a lot of freedom, as long as they aren't actively doing crimes like stabbing someone or transporting drugs. McDuff took charge of his cell block after being transferred to the retrieve unit in the Angleton area. A guy of McDuff's abilities would have been highly respected by the wardens and would have had significant sway among the inmates, giving him a say in who would be placed in his cell. While incarcerated at Retrieve, McDuff's cellmate, or punk, as the slang has it, supplied him with whatever he needed in terms of sex and drugs, which he concealed in a red balloon pushed up his rectum. This punk wasn't your typical example. He was big and icy, with plenty of body art, but he was always in danger of being killed by the Aryan Brotherhood, which undermined his intimidating image. McDuff's ability to shield his punk without damaging his own reputation speaks something about his standing in the community. Kenneth McDuff was a natural at calculating angles. This parole board favored offenders who made efforts to better themselves, so this 8th grade dropout started taking classes through the mail. McDuff was usually the first to notice when the parole board's policies changed or when a new pattern emerged. One of the 3 parole board members would meet with a group of eligible offenders, conduct interviews, and then vote yes or no on each individual case before passing the files on to the second board member. Rarely do the members even try to talk about the situations between themselves. The requirement that the governor sign off on paroles has been eliminated since the early 1980s, when Bill Clements was in office. Inmate rumor had it that if a Clements appointee voted yes on an applicant he had personally met, at least one other member was sure to go along with him, and the governor would likely follow suit. Helen Kopitka, a parole commissioner since 1975, cast the lone vote in favor of McDuff's release from prison in 1980. Attorney Gary Jackson's submissions to Kopitka's parole board were persuasive. While Kopitka remained a member of the board after 1981, McDuff requested an interview with Glenn Heckman instead. Heckman was appointed to the position by Governor Clements in January 1980. Moments after being left alone with Heckman in the chaplain's office, McDuff made good on his promise to leave $10,000 in Heckman's car's glove box if he helped him escape from the dungeon. "You're the governor's man, and I know it. The word is that you've voted for me, and I'm leaving." Heckman, hearing McDuff's offer, said something to the effect of "I'll have to think about it" before heading to the office of the Brazoria County District Attorney, where he formally accused McDuff of bribery. This was McDuff's 3rd conviction, thus under the state's old Chronic Felon Act, they might have given him life in prison without the possibility of parole until 1992. Instead, McDuff once again shown his remarkable ability to sneak his way by authorities unscathed. In spite of prosecutor Ken Dice's objections, the judge gave McDuff extensive time to tell the jury about his criminal past. However, he was not allowed to discuss the specifics of his 1966 killing spree, but rather his fabricated account of how the system had repeatedly conspired against him, with injustice piling on top of injustice and the good name McDuff being sullied by charlatans. McDuff delivered the soap opera-worthy soliloquy without breaking character. According to the requirements of the Habitual Criminal Act, the jury first decided whether or not McDuff was guilty of bribery. After reaching their verdict, the jury was obligated by law to deliberate again, this time on a purely technical matter, determining whether or not the Kenneth A. McDuff they had just found guilty was the same Kenneth A. McDuff who had been found guilty by two other juries. The jurors, however, misread the directions. They got confused by McDuff's testimony, which was partly my fault, Ken Dyes says. As the judge put it, they thought that they were supposed to rule on McDuff's guilt or innocence in the two previous cases. Of course, the jury couldn't be sure because it didn't hear the evidence in those cases. The jury decided against awarding McDuff the death penalty and instead gave him only 2 years in prison, which was a useless sentence given that McDuff had already served more than 2 years of good time while waiting for his trial. McDuff, in essence, attempted to bribe a parole officer and was successful. If the jury that convicted McDuff guilty of murder also concluded that he was likely to kill again, then why did a parole board in 1989 decide to release him back into society? Basically, by 1989 Kenneth McDuff was only a number and not even a name or a case history. In order to keep Texas prisons from exceeding court-ordered population caps, Bill Clements, the parole board, and the prison system had concluded 2 years prior that 750 offenders per week needed to be paroled. At least 1,000 offenders had to be interviewed and their papers reviewed by the 15 members of the parole board. Convicts like McDuff, whose names kept popping up year after year, stopped being interviewed and instead were grouped together with others who shared similar characteristics for special review. Inmates' files, if read at all by the board, contained only the most basic and mundane details that said almost nothing about the inmate's true personality. When McDuff was released on parole, 8 out of 10 parolees had their requests granted, but the system was still backed up. The parole board was at its wit's end, having run out of good parole risk scenarios. Then, the abyss was reached. An offender may be given credit for a year's worth of time served after only 22 days in jail. More than 36,000 convicts were granted parole in a system that could hold 60,000 the year Kenneth McDuff was released, 1989. The state's primary concern shifted from public safety to maintaining water service and avoiding interference from the federal courts. Chris Mealy, who made the deciding vote to liberate McDuff, remembers being impressed by 2 things about McDuff when he came up for special review in September 1989. The file showed that in the 6 years since McDuff became parole eligible, he had received 1 affirmative vote, and he had begun to better himself by enrolling in college credit courses. Mealy concedes that, looking back, he may have made a mistake. If any of what we know is genuine, then definitely a mistake was made. We created this system. Mistakes are inevitable. Some of them will cost a lot of money. I wish I could go back and change that. However, twice the parole board missed opportunities to help Kenneth McDuff. 9 months after his release, in July 1990, McDuff was charged with a new crime, making a terroristic threat. Although this was a misdemeanor, it was a serious enough infraction to send McDuff back in prison for the rest of his life, as it had been committed while he was on parole. The accusation stems from a racially charged encounter in Rosebud's Main Street. After yelling racial obscenities at a group of black teens who were going about their day, McDuff chased one of them down an alley with a knife and threatened to kill him. Gary Jackson had to yell at his client McDuff to stop him from further damaging his claim of innocence as McDuff poured forth his hatred for blacks at his preliminary parole revocation hearing. In September, McDuff was sent back to TDCJ, but the system failed again. District Attorney Tom Sihon of Falls County, after consulting with Sheriff Larry Pamplin, took the fateful decision to withdraw the misdemeanor prosecution against McDuff and turn the matter over to the parole board. Most of his witnesses were too afraid to testify. Sihon labeled McDuff the most extraordinarily violent criminal ever to set foot in Falls County in a letter he addressed to the board, urging them not to reinstate McDuff's parole because he posed a continued threat to the community. Gary Jackson, however, formally requested that McDuff's parole be restored. He mentioned that the original charge that led to the suspension had been dropped. The subsequent events exemplified the worst aspects of bureaucracy. The board has delegated the authority to revoke and reinstate parole to its employees for many years, despite the fact that some attorneys believe this practice is unlawful. There was never any sort of trial, and no witnesses or advocates spoke up. There was no official vote on whether or not to restore McDuff's parole. Some unnamed hearing officer apparently saw no cause to continue holding Kenneth McDuff. Kenneth McDuff was released from prison on December 6, 1990. Don't make me. Even before they had hard evidence, Sheriff Larry Pamplin and his buddies at the Waco U.S. Marshal's Office, the McNamara's, knew that McDuff was on the loose again. The most frustrating part, adds Pamplin, is that we knew he was going to kill someone. It wasn't clear what they could do, and we didn't know when or where it would happen. Pamplin has jurisdiction until McDuff commits a crime in Falls County, and the McNamara's can only look into it if McDuff becomes a federal fugitive. Though they did what they could, the three lawmen nevertheless lost track of McDuff. At first, at least, McDuff was able to stay on good terms with his parole officer and generate little interest from other law enforcement agencies in his whereabouts. McDuff was constantly uprooting his life, whether it was to Temple, Rockdale, Cameron, Belmead, Tyler, or Dallas, to be near his mother or one of his sisters. He did so despite having no obvious means of support, buying brand new cars, spending lavishly, and mugging crack dealers on the street. His movements were so erratic that it was nearly hard for Pamplin and the McNamara's to link him to any one death. Weeks after the fact, they found out about numerous of the murders for which McDuff is now being held responsible. McDuff moved into a campus dorm in the spring of 1991 after enrolling at Texas State Technical College in Waco. Waco police didn't seem alarmed by the disappearances of other prostitutes in the region beginning at that time or in the months that followed, and they didn't seem to press McDuff with tough inquiries. Police saw a woman named Regina Moore yelling in the back of McDuff's red pickup truck as it sped by a roadblock, and though they tracked him down and questioned him a few days later, nothing came of it. Despite the fact that he had nearly blinded a fellow TSTC student through brutal beating and had threatened numerous others, nobody had reported him to the authorities. It was a sweet gig, being a student by day and a drugged-out scavenger at night with no one to challenge it. Then, a week before his final examinations, McDuff stopped trying to act cool. He left his tan Thunderbird parked at the New Road in south of Waco on the evening of March 1, 1992, and fled into the night. Melissa Northrup, 22, was abducted from the convenience shop where she worked the same night. The store was located less than a block away. Weeks later, her body was discovered floating face down in a Dallas County gravel dump, not far from where her automobile had been abandoned by her murderer. A shallow burial in the woods behind TSTC contained the naked, horribly decomposed body of Valencia Joshua a few weeks after Northrup disappeared. One of the prostitutes, named Joshua, went missing. On the evening of February 24, she was spotted walking around the TSTC campus in search of McDuff's dorm. The disappearance of McDuff struck the parole board and the public by surprise. Addie McDuff reported her missing out of extreme concern. The McNamara's, aware of McDuff's past, took swift action, and the system delivered this time. McDuff had supplied cocaine to an informant, which was a huge error that helped the police catch him. Waco's Assistant U.S. Attorney Bill Johnson filed charges of handgun possession and narcotics distribution against McDuff based on information from two confidential sources. McDuff had become a federal fugitive without realizing it, and that was enough for the McNamara's to start hunting for him. Already, 250 agents from the U.S. Marshal Service were working on Operation Gunsmoke, a nationwide initiative to arrest violent criminals. McDuff's nefarious grin made him a perfect candidate for Operation Gunsmoke. Waco had built a powerful Kenneth McDuff task force by early March. There were about 24 federal marshals from Operation Gunsmoke, including 2 of the agency's international super sleuths, Mike Carnevale of San Antonio and Dan Stoltz of Houston, officers from several county and local police departments, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the Drug Enforcement Administration, Texas Rangers, and an investigator from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The capture of McDuff had risen in importance to the national level. The Marshal Service's Enforcement Division in Washington, D.C., is led by Mike Earp, a distant relative of the most famous marshal of them all, Wyatt Earp. "Until I actually got on the scene down in Texas," says Earp, "I didn't realize what an impact McDuff had on those small communities, that people were absolutely terrified of the man." Red October, which was stationed in the parking lot behind the Waco Federal Building for the duration of the search, connected the task force to every police department in the United States. The Marshal Service is the nation's oldest law enforcement agency, having been formed in 1789 by George Washington. It only seemed fitting that they be tasked with finding one of the greatest murders of modern times. In this potentially fatal race against time, it made sense for Parnell and Mike McNamara to take the lead. The task group concentrated their efforts on finding McDuff and his ex-convict running buddies in Temple and the surrounding areas. McDuff's dark history was dismantled piece by piece. They interrogated a few local Holland residents whose family photo albums were dominated by images from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. One marshal stated matter-of-factly that one of the boys told them that after his father murdered his mother, the old man had only stabbed him once and beat him twice with a tire tool. The finding that Kenneth McDuff had a daughter came as a complete surprise. In 1964, he assaulted and abandoned a woman who would later give birth to his child. Teresa found out at age 21 that her biological father, Kenneth McDuff, was in prison for murder. Teresa lied to the marshals and said that she visited McDuff in jail and developed a crush on him. He lobbied her to help him sneak drugs into the country. McDuff, fresh off his parole, proposed acting as her pimp in Sin City. She further claimed to the marshals that McDuff's release from jail in 1989 was purchased with a $25,000 bribe to a previous member of the parole board. This allegation has prompted the ongoing investigation of numerous former parole board members. Teresa has left the state to get as far away from Kenneth McDuff as possible after losing interest in him. McDuff's allies were initially too loyal, or perhaps too scared, to reveal much. The McNamaras found a way to make them more pliable. They would start telling the gory details of McDuff's murder spree in 1966 and observe the audience's reaction. Sure, his friends knew from McDuff's time behind bars that he had murdered several people, but they didn't know the specifics, that there were 3 victims, that 2 of them were children, that the boys had pleaded with McDuff on their knees as he blew off their faces, that Edna Sullivan's eyes had filled with terror as McDuff leaned his full weight onto the broomstick pressed across her throat. Even the most remorseful criminals had something to say about the story. Law enforcement officers from multiple agencies had to work in shifts of 18 hours, sometimes for days on end, as part of the exhaustive search. Rather than return to their hotel room, they would often spend the night curled up on the floor in the Waco Marshal's office. But gradually, they started piecing the puzzle together. In the parking lot of the Temple establishment Poor Boys Lounge, they were able to catch McDuff's ex-punk. In the end, they convinced him to tell them about a female drug dealer in Harker Heights, who put them in touch with a thug in Dallas, who revealed that he had spent Christmas Day in Austin with McDuff. This was a very intriguing discovery since it showed that McDuff had been in the capital city 5 days before Colleen Reed, 28, was kidnapped from a car wash west of downtown. According to eyewitnesses, McDuff's Thunderbird was the tan car with rounded taillights that grabbed Reed and drove off in the wrong direction along West 5th Street. One of the numerous ways McDuff flaunted his disdain for social norms was by driving the wrong way down one-way streets. Police in Austin were under intense public pressure to solve the Reed case, but they didn't consider McDuff a suspect because he hadn't been in town since October, as reported by their informants. However, McDuff was the obvious choice for the McNamaras. Looking for a second passenger in the tan automobile who matched the description of a Hispanic or dark-complected white male, they started going through McDuff's list of friends. They paused at Alva Hank Worley's name. Worley, a 34-year-old concrete worker and close friend of McDuff's, not only matched the profile but exemplified the type of passive, compliant companion McDuff favored. They thought of Hank Worley as a Roy Dale Green for the 1990s, someone troubled by his past actions yet willing to open up about them. The McNamara's and a Bell County sheriff's officer went to the Blooms Motel south of Temple, where Worley and his daughter of that age were staying, late one night. The decision to wait until the wee hours was made for strategic psychological reasons. Worley's remark that he scarcely knew Kenneth McDuff confirmed their low expectations for his initial appearance. Hank Worley didn't flinch when Mike McNamara detailed McDuff's murder spree in graphic detail. Mike said to his brother in the car, "That was not a normal reaction. Apparently, he knows something." For the next 2 weeks, the marshals and the deputy made surprise visits to the Blooms Motel, catching Worley off guard each time. This is called driving a suspect up, and it was a tactic Mike McNamara had learned over the course of his 21 years as a cop. Because criminals are generally unmotivated, you have to outwork them, work while they sleep, and leave no doubt in their minds about the relentlessness of your pursuit. And on their 5th visit, several marshals saw Worley and his pals cooking and enjoying several brews together. Mike McNamara saw Worley's daughter over his shoulder and began his diatribe with her in mind. "Hank, you're hiding a kid killer, you know that? You're trying to shield a man who raped, beat, and strangled a young woman not much older than your own daughter. Imagine her laying on the ground with a broomstick across her throat, pleading with you to intervene and save the life of another girl." That's when Hank Worley started screaming. After Worley had collected himself, he explained that he and McDuff had driven to Austin 4 days after Christmas in search of drugs. They went on a pub crawl along 6th Street and into the University District before crossing Lamar and taking a side street south to return the way they came. Colleen Reed was washing her black Mazda when McDuff saw her in one of the bays at the 5th Street car wash. Like Edna Sullivan in 1966, she was picked at random. McDuff parked his Thunderbird in the space next to him and vanished for a short while. When he came back, he was holding Colleen Reed by the throat, raising her off the ground so that only her feet were visible. "Please, not me," she pleaded. McDuff pushed her into the back seat and sent Worley there to keep her under control after she said, "Not me." McDuff stopped his car a little distance from Austin and switched drivers with Worley. McDuff stripped Colleen Reed naked, snuffed out a cigarette between her knees, and began raping her while Worley drove down I-35. Worley had to switch positions again and saw that her hands were bound behind her back. Worley stripped naked and engaged in oral sex with McDuff while she drove. He eventually raped her. McDuff exited I-20 onto Texas State Highway 317 north of Belton to go closer to his parents' home. He pulled over to the side of the road and raped Colleen Reed once more. Once the young woman was able to get to her feet, she rested her head on Worley's shoulder and pleaded, "Please don't let him hurt me anymore." At that, McDuff grabbed her by the back of the neck, threw her into the trunk of the Thunderbird, and locked the door. Worley inquired as to McDuff's plans for the woman when he was dropped off by McDuff that evening. "I'm going to use her up," McDuff said with a grin. One of McDuff's favorite expressions, it implied he had murder in mind. Colleen Reed was last seen at a frame house, and police suspect that McDuff buried her there. Addie McDuff is still alive, however her body has yet to be located. The media got their hands on Worley's remarks, and the McDuff task force got the national attention it so desperately needed. 50 suggestions were sent after America's Most Wanted highlighted the search for Kenneth McDuff on May 1st. 3 days later, a viewer called police in Kansas City, Missouri, after realizing that the womanizing garbage truck driver Fowler was actually the Texas serial killer McDuff. A few hours later, McDuff gave up without a fight at the city landfill. Seraphia Parker, whose body was discovered outside Temple 3 days after McDuff was paroled, is the first of at least 9 women who investigators believe McDuff may have killed. In Waco, he is on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Colleen Reed, in addition to the capital murder charges for the killings of Valencia Joshua and Melissa Northrup. When debating how to handle McDuff, both federal and state prosecutors agree that the prosecutor who can construct the strongest capital case should have the first opportunity to do so. Hopefully this time the system will make the proper call. Kenneth McDuff is the best case for capital punishment that has ever been presented.